The first time the Americans saw the Australians' boots, they laughed. It was at a forward staging post outside Phuoc Tuy province. A joint patrol briefing had just wrapped up. The Americans, young, sharp, geared head to toe in regulation issue kit, were sipping instant coffee and prepping gear. Then came the SAS team, 5 of them, dirty, calm, and wearing boots that looked butchered. The upper leather had been sliced away from the ankles down. No laces, just strips of canvas tape and rubber bands. One American, a sergeant with a loud voice and mirrored sunglasses, pointed and cracked, "What's the matter? Charlie steal your supply truck?" Laughter rolled across the sandbags. The SAS didn't respond. One of them, a wiry scout with a face like stone, just adjusted the tape around his foot and kept walking toward the tree line. Another American muttered, "You'd think they'd issue real gear to Tier 1 guys." To the Americans, it looked like sloppiness, improvisation, maybe even poverty of supply. Real soldiers, the kind with doctrine and funding, didn't mutilate their boots. But what they didn't know, what they wouldn't understand until hours later, was this. In Vietnam's jungle, the difference between standard and smart could be measured in inches of trench foot or liters of blood. And when the rain came, the joke would turn around. Fast. The American team, 6 men drawn from recon and special operations units, were textbook examples of U.S. doctrine. Jungle boots laced tight to mid-calf, starched ERDL camouflage, lightweight web gear holding spare mags, a first aid pouch, a compass, water purification tablets, and a laminated map pouch with grease pencil markings. Each man carried a pristine M16, sling adjusted to regulation length. Their boots were triple-checked, laces knotted, soles cleaned with a wire brush that morning. Their socks? Standard issue wool blend, fresh out of plastic. Before heading out, their team leader, Lieutenant Clark, ran through a 10-point gear checklist. Everything accounted for. Radios tested, frequencies confirmed, coordinates entered, backup batteries double-packed. It wasn't arrogance, it was training. Clark had grown up inside the doctrine. He believed in systems, fire teams, exfil plans, air support. He didn't fear the jungle. He respected it, sure, but he also believed it could be controlled, navigated, beaten with the right equipment, the right procedures. He glanced again at the Australians, now crouched under a camphor tree. Their gear looked like it had survived another war entirely. Jungle green shirts bleached by sun and sweat, webbing patched with local fabric. One of them had wrapped a machete in cloth and tape to keep it silent. No one carried a radio. And those boots, torn open like old boxing gloves, still looked like a crime against common sense. Clark leaned toward his commsman and whispered, "They're gonna lose their feet by nightfall." The commsman grinned. "Bet they've already lost their standards." There was laughter, but it was nervous now. Because while the Americans looked ready, the Australians looked finished. Like they had already done the patrol. Like they had already seen this route. Like they knew something the Americans didn't, and just weren't going to explain it. Still, as they set off, the U.S. team felt confident. They had the manuals, the backup, the full kit, and best of all, the weather was holding. The jungle was muggy but dry. Spirits were high. Footing was solid. The boots were doing their job. Clark took the lead with pride, thinking to himself, if they want to hike barefoot through hell, let them. We'll see who's limping first. Hours later, the clouds began to gather. And by nightfall, the jungle would teach its lesson, not with gunfire or ambush, but with water. The kind that seeps, stays, and never forgets where it settles. They weren't trying to impress anyone. The 5 Australians from SASR didn't walk like men on parade. They moved like predators, light on their feet, silent, casual. Their gear was stripped to the bare minimum. A single water bottle, field knife, taped magazines, and in some cases, no spare clothing at all. One had a rusted old Owen gun with its stock replaced by a block of wood. Another had electrical tape wrapped around the barrel of his L1A1 to prevent metal-on-metal noise. And all of them had the same strange footwear. Jungle boots that had been cut down, stripped open from ankle to toe, laces removed, canvas sides gone. To the Americans, it looked like madness. Lieutenant Clark finally asked during a short water break. He couldn't help it. "What happened to your boots?" One of the SAS, a broad-chested corporal with a thick Queensland accent, looked down at his feet, then up at Clark like he'd asked why trees were green. "Ha, cut him," he said. Clark blinked. "On purpose?" The Aussie smirked. "Mate, in 2 hours, it's not a boot. It's a bloody bucket. Rather cut it myself than let it rot my feet off." There was no bravado in the statement. No attempt to convert or explain further. Just the quiet certainty of someone who had already paid the price for wearing boots the wrong way and wasn't about to do it again. Clark shook his head. To him, boots were protection, structure. His instructors back in the States had drilled it in. Secure your feet and they'll carry you through the fight. But the jungle didn't care about training doctrine. It cared about water, weight, and wounds. And right now, Clark's socks were already damp, and the rain hadn't even started yet. Further down the line, one American muttered, "They look like convicts." One of the Australians heard him. A young scout, no older than 20. He didn't respond with a glare or a retort. He just raised his muddy foot, wiggled his toes in the air, and smiled. No words, no argument, just an unspoken truth. "Laugh now, mate. Let's see how you're walking by tomorrow." The Americans went quiet after that. The Aussies never mocked back. They didn't need to, because in the jungle the boots didn't lie, and the rain was already moving in from the east. The rain didn't arrive with drama. There was no thunder, no warning, just a slow, heavy drip at first. Fat drops punching through the canopy, darkening the red earth beneath their boots. Then another, and another. Within minutes, the jungle exhaled water. For the Australians, nothing changed. They didn't stop, didn't adjust pace, didn't even look up. Water ran down their legs, straight through the cut boots, back into the soil where it belonged. Their feet stayed light, moving, free. The Americans noticed it almost immediately. At first, it was just discomfort, that squelching sound every time a foot hit the ground. Then the weight came. Each boot filled, held the water, refused to let it go. The socks absorbed it all like sponges. Every step became heavier than the last. "Hold up," one of the Americans muttered, kneeling to dump water from his boot. The team paused. The rain intensified. Mud formed fast, slick, sticky, clinging. Roots turned into traps. Slopes became slides. The Americans began to slip. Not fall, not yet, but enough to break rhythm. The Australians flowed ahead, barely disturbed. Lieutenant Clark tried to ignore the growing ache in his feet. He told himself it was temporary, that his boots were designed for this. Drainage holes, the manual had said, ventilation eyelets. But those holes clogged with mud. The water stayed. By the second hour of rain, the skin on his heels felt raw. Every step rubbed, every step burned. Another American stopped, breathing hard. "Sir, my feet are going numb." Clark looked back at the Australians, now 30 meters ahead, already scanning the tree line like nothing had changed. He felt the first flicker of doubt. Not loud, not panicked, just sharp. This wasn't an ambush. This wasn't enemy fire. This was weather, and it was winning. By late afternoon, one of the Americans was limping. Another was bleeding through his sock. They'd stopped joking. No one mentioned the boots anymore. An Australian scout finally glanced back. He didn't smirk, didn't gloat. He just said quietly, "Welcome to the wet." Then he turned and kept moving. By the next morning, the jokes were gone. They moved in silence now, not because of stealth, but because pain had taken the energy out of conversation. The American team was limping, shifting weight from foot to foot, trying to mask the damage. But the jungle could smell weakness like blood in the water. The blisters had come overnight. First hot spots, then tearing, then fluid. Now skin peeled open in raw patches where boot leather and wet socks had ground against flesh for 15 hours. One of the men, a tall private with a background in mountain warfare, finally broke. He sat down on a log, unstrapped his boot, and peeled back the sock. The skin came with it. Clark winced. The others looked away. Pus, blood, and shredded tissue lined the sole of his foot. The toes were swollen, purple. The heel had ruptured. The jungle had chewed through him. Not with teeth, but with moisture and friction. Clark dropped to one knee. "Medkit." They wrapped the foot in gauze. It soaked through in under a minute. The patrol stalled. The Americans were visibly struggling. Gear that once looked squared away now sagged. Their boots, once a symbol of structure and pride, now squelched with every step like soaked loaves of bread. The Australians hadn't stopped moving. They had broken off ahead, looping through the terrain like phantoms. One finally circled back, the same corporal from before. He crouched near the wounded man, glanced at the foot, and simply nodded. Then he stood up, reached into his belt pouch, and pulled out a small piece of hacksaw blade, sharpened, blackened with soot, worn from use. He held it out to Clark. "If you want to stay on your feet, you might want to ruin those boots too." Clark didn't take it, not yet. Pride still held a little weight. The corporal didn't wait. He turned and disappeared into the foliage. No lecture, no "I told you so." Just an offer, one soldier to another, not to prove superiority, but to keep them moving. Clark looked at the saw blade, looked at his men, then looked down at his own boots, already filling with water again. The rain hadn't stopped, and the trail was only going to get worse. By the next afternoon, movement had become misery. The Americans limped through the jungle now, each step an argument with pain. Blisters had opened. Blood had soaked through socks. The boots that once gleamed with polish were now bloated leather traps, holding water, heat, and rot. No one laughed anymore. No one spoke. The Australians didn't say "I told you so." They didn't need to. They kept walking, steady, deliberate, quiet. Their cut-down boots flexed with the terrain, draining as they moved. No sloshing, no slipping, just rhythm. Clark watched one of them step through a waist-deep mud pool, emerge on the other side, and keep going like it was nothing. He tried the same. His foot stuck. He pulled hard and the boot tore something in his ankle. He cursed loud. The jungle didn't care. Behind him, one of his men, Private Lewis, dropped to a knee. "I can't. My heel's gone, sir. It's raw." Clark turned to reply, but before he could speak, the same Australian corporal from before appeared at his side. No sound, just there. He looked at Lewis's boot, then at the blood soaking through the laces. With a calm that bordered on boredom, he knelt, took out the same hacksaw blade, and without asking, began sawing through the boot's upper leather. Lewis winced. The corporal kept going. When he finished, the top half of the boot hung like a peeled skin. The foot could breathe now. The water ran off. He nodded once, then moved on. No lecture, no smile, no judgment. Clark watched him disappear into the trees, then looked at the piece of saw blade still in his hand from the day before. Slowly, he crouched down and began cutting his own boots. The same boots he'd worn for over a year. The ones he once thought defined what a soldier looked like. The leather tore easier than he expected, and just like that, so did the pride. They walked the rest of the trail in silence, not in defeat, but in adjustment. Step by step, they learned to flow instead of fight. Their feet bled less. Their balance returned. They stopped trying to correct the jungle. They just moved. At the rear of the line, Lewis whispered under his breath, "They knew all along." Clark didn't reply. He didn't need to. He just kept walking. By the fourth day, the rain hadn't stopped, but the resistance had. The Americans no longer complained. They no longer questioned the Australians' strange methods or battered gear. They had learned to tape their ankles like the SAS, learned to dry their socks with body heat at night. Some had even carved their own boots, hacking away leather in quiet moments by the fire. No one called it copying. No one called it anything. It just was. That morning, the two teams crossed a shallow ravine. The Americans moved slowly, testing every step. The Australians crossed like ghosts, sure-footed, precise. Clark watched them from the bank, a quiet frown on his face, not of frustration, but of realization. He understood now what he hadn't at the start. The cut boots, the stripped-down gear, the silence. It wasn't improvisation. It wasn't desperation. It was design, the product of time, blood, and the jungle's quiet feedback loop. And none of it had come from a manual. Later, while pausing beneath a thick patch of canopy to dry out their shirts, one of the younger Americans, Corporal Bell, looked over at the Australians. He hadn't said much since the rain began, but now with half his foot wrapped in gauze and his boots nearly unrecognizable, he muttered, "They knew all this from day one." No one answered. They didn't need to. One of the Australians, the same scout who'd smiled days ago at the convict comment, caught Bell's eye. He didn't grin this time. He just nodded once, respectful, as if to say, "Now you get it." Bell nodded back. The Americans didn't ask for help, and the Australians didn't offer advice. But in that moment, The two teams understood each other in a way no briefing ever could. They weren't the same, not in doctrine, not in culture, not in style, but they both knew pain and sweat and what it meant to walk with blood in your boots and still keep going. And that was enough. As they moved on, the jungle swallowed their trail behind them. No footprints, no voices, just motion. Lean, silent, and learned. The Americans were still slower, still less efficient, but now they were listening, watching, adjusting. And the Australians, they kept walking, same pace, same silence. They had never tried to prove a point. They had simply survived better. When they returned to the fire base, it was just another day for the war. A Huey lifted off in the distance. A canteen clanged against a metal pole. Somewhere, a new group of fresh boots were unloading crates of equipment. Dry, shiny, clean. The patrol was over. Clark's team stepped off the trail quietly, mud-streaked, blistered, and changed. No one said much. A logistics officer walked past and looked down at their feet. "What the hell happened to your boots?" Huey asked. Clark didn't respond. He didn't need to. Behind him, Lewis hobbled forward, one boot cut nearly to the sole, held together by tape, blood, and humility. He didn't flinch at the question. He just muttered, "We made them better." The SAS team gave no farewell. They simply nodded, passed through the concertina wire, and disappeared back into the trees they came from. No handshakes, no report, no ceremony. Clark watched them go, those strange, ragged men who had taught him more in 4 days than a dozen field manuals ever could. Later that night, back in his hooch, Clark sat on his cot, boots off, feet wrapped in gauze. He reached into his pack and pulled out the little saw blade the Australian corporal had given him. It was still there. Dull now, rusting slightly, but real. He placed it on the table next to his sidearm. Then slowly he opened his patrol report form. He stared at the section labeled, "Recommendations for Equipment Improvement." He wrote, "Recommend issuing field teams with optional blade tools for boot modification in prolonged wet operations. Field drainage essential. Australian forces demonstrate superior adaptive technique." He paused. Then under remarks, he added a final line. "Let the new guys laugh. The rain will teach them." That was all. He closed the folder and turned off the light. Outside, the jungle buzzed, just as wet, just as unforgiving, just as patient. And somewhere in the dark, 5 Australians were already walking again. Light, quiet, unbothered by rank or standard. Their boots cut, their path clear.